Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Ritik. I think we're gonna wait for 1 minute while people file in here. Give everyone a chance to join the session. Really excited to see what you have to present for us today. While we're on the topic of logistics, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will be getting a Q&A session afterwards. We'll be getting to all the questions. So if you have any burning questions or anything pops up during the presentation, put it down in the chat immediately so you don't forget it, and we'll get to them afterwards. I think we should be ready to begin here. Thank you to everyone who just joined us. We're here with Ritik from Sublime, and we're really excited to see what he has in store for us today. I'll let you take it away. I think you can do an intro for yourself a little bit better than I can, but so the floor is all yours.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Lou. So hey guys, I'm Ritik from Sublime. So let me actually share my screen, and I can start right away. So my slides are visible, right?
You're good.
Cool. So I'll be doing the short workshop on Sublime today. And so we are actually a pretty new protocol. We are about to launch our alpha in the next 1 to 2 weeks. So I thought it would be a good way for me to also start talking about what Sublime is, how we're approaching the problem of under-collateralization in general. So what is Sublime? Sublime is a decentralized protocol that's trying to enable credit by collateralizing social capital. So there's majorly two different ways in which people like to think about under collateralization. The main focus so far has been on this idea of credit scoring, but credit scoring in general is pretty hard. So it's essentially a problem of capturing or sort of curating as good data as you possibly can. So in general, credit scoring, any kind of such data intensive problems requires thousands of different features. So Tala, for example, which is an alternative fintech firm that does lending in Africa, Latin America, they actually try to source thousands of different features from people's mobile phones. So they look for very simple features such as your age, your name, your gender, but they'll also look for a lot less intuitive features such as how are you storing addresses on your contact books? How fast are you reading the terms of conditions? Or how many mistakes you're making while filling out their forms. So they go for really, really minute data. And the reason for this is because in general, credit is a pretty hard problem. So the way most such algorithms work is that they try to minimize their type 1 errors, which is basically they try to filter out for as many people as possible so that they can lower the probability of default, even if it means that you're giving away a bunch of good borrowers who would have repaid their loans on time. And to capture those borrowers that sort of fall past this first filter, you need to increasingly look for better and better quality data. So it's a tough job, and it's also exclusionary in most cases. So there isn't really a one size fits for all solution for credit scoring. So like different jurisdictions have different kinds of credit scoring. So the way it's calculated in India is different from the way it's calculated in the US. And even different segments of loans have different ways of calculating scores. So if you're taking out a loan for a business, the assessment process is going to be entirely different from the way it will happen for a personal loan, for example. In fact, 67% of the adult population is not even covered by any kind of credit bureau. And this coverage, this 33% coverage is actually by includes private credit bureaus. So if you actually just look at public credit bureaus, that number even falls lower. But this does not mean that the 67% of adults are not really borrowing money. They just rely on different sources of income, different sources of gaining access to credit. In most cases, it happens to be from their friends and family members or their circles of trust. Note that in this graph, the borrowed informally sector is actually kind of like the lower limit because it's easier to track any kind of formal borrowing, whereas it's harder to track any kind of informal borrowing. For example, if you're going to shop at your local mom and pop store who knows you for a couple of years and you don't have money, he'll probably let you buy anything as long as you promise that you'll pay it back over time. So these are also examples of credit because it's happening on this idea of trust between you and the shopkeeper. But these kind of transactions are very hard to actually track, even for any person, any participant taking part in a survey. So this kind of acts like the lower bound. So the actual credit that happens informally is a lot more. So this idea of trust circles is something that we are trying to work on and sort of implement on a much larger scale. So in our kind of trust circle, what we're essentially doing is trying to bring in as many different kinds of stakeholders to allow them to start sort of delegating any kinds of credit that they're comfortable with amongst each other. So the kind of stakeholders could be DAOs, they could be community members within those DAOs, they could be normal consumers, these could be off-chain retail borrowers or off-chain retail lenders. These could also be institutions like market makers or trading firms that are just DeFi native, or it could be entirely pseudonymous identities. The idea is that once you start having this trust network, whenever there's a new loan request that someone has within this network, it should be possible for us to find the most efficient path to actually fulfill this loan request. And notice that this does not require a direct link between the borrower and the lender. It's possible for us to leverage the trust network itself to find the most capital efficient path, even if there's no direct links. So a natural question that comes up is, does every lender have to perform the risk assessment for every single borrower? And the straightforward answer is no, it's not really necessary. You should actually just be delegating credit to borrowers that you fully trust. So examples of someone that you would trust offline are your friends and family members, right? So you wouldn't really be asking for their income slips or their bank statements for the past 6 months to actually lend them small amounts of money. So on chain, the examples of such people could just be huge institutions that have a large amount of reputation attached to their names, or it could just be DAOs or community members within DAOs you're active, whom you really, really trust. You just need to start delegating your trust to those, you just need to start delegating credit to those kind of people. And then the network, the properties of the network itself essentially enable the propagation of credit. So in our entire model, we actually use collateral ratios as a proxy for trust. So naturally, if the collateral requirements are higher, then that usually means that you trust a particular person lower. Also note that the collateral requirements don't necessarily have to be less than 100%. You can start off at 200% and you can gradually keep on increasing it down as you get more and more comfortable with this particular borrower. So let me start off with some of the different aspects that we're dealing with when we come, some of the different pillars that we're working with as far as Sublime is concerned. So the first is the idea of verification. So what we want to do is essentially enable every wallet address to essentially utilize any kind of reputation attached to the identities. So that requires us to link up the digital identities with the wallet addresses. So the way that we work with it, the way that we actually solve this is that we have these special roles called verifiers, which essentially create these links between addresses and any identity. So, for example, the first verification that we support is verification by Twitter. For this particular verification, the admin or the team in this case is the one that's performing the verification. So the Sublime team is the one performing the verification. And what we basically do is something that a lot of you must have come across usually. So we essentially ask users to sign a particular message with their wallet address. Then we ask them to post it onto their Twitter accounts, which is then essentially cross-checked by us, verified by us, that the message is what we should expect it to be. And then we just store this particular linkage on our smart contracts. So now it's possible for us to also onboard other verifiers. So for example, there's someone who wants to now act as a verifier for Twitch streamers. It's possible for us to essentially have them onboarded either through admin initially or through governance votes later on. And once you have this verifier, they're the one who actually do the entire verification process. So the way that it actually happens is by calling this particular function called register master address, which essentially just stores this linkage of address to particular uh, identifier. And every single verifier has its own contract that is actually created, a storage contract, which is used to store all of these different mappings. It's also possible for you to now, for the verifier actually, to now start linking secondary addresses once this primary address has been linked. So what use case can we think out of this, just this verification module itself? So you can imagine that there could be some specific debt products that should only be open to certain members. So now let's say you are a member of an NFT DAO, and this NFT DAO has a bunch of community members. And what it wants to do is raise debt and use that debt to buy new NFTs that are going to get added to their DAO. So what they would like to do is essentially just let some specific people to actually lend money into their particular capital raise. And in this case, those specific people might just be the community members, the existing community members of that DAO. So they can essentially come on as a verifier on our protocol. They can just verify those specific lenders that are already a part of the DAO. And then once they essentially supply capital into this pool, it's possible for now to uh, get them an ownership of any new NFTs that are bought using this capital raise. The second component is the idea of savings account itself. So the savings account feature allows users to park any idle liquidity within the protocol itself. So what we do is that we have integrations set up with different yield generating protocols, which we call passive yield strategies. So currently we have integrations with Aave, Compound, and Wired. And what this allows is that, so essentially every user, every pool or every credit line, which are the two ways in which loans work, all of them have a savings account attached to their name. So any balance that is there on Sublime smart contracts, any collateral that is logged for any of these different loans, all of those can be now delegated to any of these different protocols, or it can just be logged within our contracts if that's what you choose to do. And it's possible for you to now keep on earning yield uh, from within the protocol itself. So and it's essentially possible for us to now even keep on adding newer strategies to the savings account itself. So if you have any more strategies to also build, it's possible for us to have that onboarded as a separate strategy. So now we come to the first way in which loans work. So pools is the way in which, so pools are one of the ways in which loans work on Sublime. With pools, the idea is that there's a single borrower and there are multiple lenders who want to supply liquidity into this particular loan request. For this particular method of raising capital, the borrower has to verify themselves. So they need to use one of the verifiers that was mentioned in the previous slides to be able to create loan requests via pools. And it's possible for, as I mentioned, multiple lenders to satisfy a single loan request. So let's say if I want to raise $1 million, it's possible for you to just supply $1,000 out of that $1 million loan. So here's sort of a brief overview of the entire life cycle of a pool-based loan. So there's a pool creation, then every pool enters a collection period during which lenders can start supplying capital into this particular loan request. Once the collection period ends, there's a loan withdrawal period. So it's a specific time within which the borrower has to withdraw whatever they've collected. And once they've actually withdrawn the capital, the loan goes active. And during the active stage itself, there can be a bunch of different things happen. So there's a they have to continuously repay off their loans. It's possible for them to ask for extensions on any repayments. It's possible for lenders to use any sort of margin calls to force the borrower to put in extra collateral. And once all of that happens, once the loan period ends, the pool goes into the close stage. So these sort of branches in some sense are some of the variations that can happen through this flow. So for example, during the collection period itself, it's possible for the pool creator to cancel the loan request. if there's some case in which the borrower doesn't meet a repayment, then the loan essentially goes into a defaulted stage. And it's also possible for us to terminate any specific loan request if it comes to attention that this is actually a malicious person. So initially, this role will also be handled by the admin, but it's possible for this to be handed over to the governance over time. So one cool feature about pools is that whenever a borrower creates a loan request and a lender supplies capital, every lender gets ERC20 tokens that represent their position within that specific pool. So let's say if someone is borrowing $1 million and I supply $1,000 out of it, I get a bunch of pool tokens that represent my $1,000 worth of possession in this loan request. These pool tokens are also the reason why you can actually withdraw any kind of repayments that the borrower makes. And it also allows for a bunch of different use cases as well. So one of the sort of interesting use cases is building structured debt products using these pool tokens. So let's say you as a lender have lent capital to a bunch of different borrowers. In this specific example, maybe you've lent money to an institutional borrower, a DAO, as well as some specific community member. You receive pool tokens that represent your share in each of these different loan positions, right? What you can do is now you can sort of package all of these different pool tokens into a single ERC20 pool token. And that essentially becomes a collateralized debt obligation, which means that, collateralized debt obligations are essentially packaging a bunch of different loans together and selling that bundle to a third person. And what this does is that it now allows the new owner of the CDO to sort of expose them to a much more wider range of risk as well as reward. So the community member, for example, in this case, would be someone who might present a higher risk, but at the same time, it's also likely that they're also paying a higher interest rate. And that could be countered by the fact that there's an institutional borrower and there's also a DAO that's borrowing from within this particular token. So the probability of default is essentially getting mitigated to some extent. So as I mentioned, the pools themselves provide a huge amount of flexibility. So these are some of the different parameters that have to be set while creating a particular pool. So pool size, for example, is how much you want to borrow. Minimum borrow amount is, for example, what is the minimum amount that should be collected for the loan request to go active. Then you can set the assets that you want. So currently we support all ERC20 assets. So it's possible for you to set any collateral asset, any borrow token asset, the collateral ratio, the number of repayments that should happen, how long should each repayment interval be, and what is the saving strategy. So where should the collateral be deposited as long as it's locked for this particular loan. But just because we have all of these options, it's not necessary for you to use all of these. So what you can potentially do is create a wrapper function, which calls this create pool function. And while calling this create pool function, you can hard code some particular features. So for example, if you just want to create over collateralized pools, you can create a wrapper function which the front-end users will be using, and you hard code the collateral ratio required to 200%. And that calls this particular create pool function. So these are some of the actions that the different stakeholders can take in a pool itself. So they can create pools, supply capital, execute margin calls, etc., etc. Again, you can still just focus on the functions that you actually want to work with, and create products just using those specific functions. So credit lines is the second way in which loans work. With credit lines, the idea is that there's a single borrower and a single lender. And more specifically, in this case, the borrower does not have to have themselves verified. So it's possible for the borrower to remain anonymous in this case. This is very interesting because now you can actually allow the borrower to remain anonymous on chain. So what could happen is that you can now create identity proxies for this particular borrower to gain access to capital. So let's say there's some particular borrower, let's call him borrower A, that wants to keep their identity hidden, but they also want to borrow some money. What they can do is that they can approach a different borrower B, who's the person in the middle over here, and ask them to delegate a credit line to them. And what the borrower B cannot do is that if if let's say the borrower B has no problem in revealing their identity publicly, what they can do is now they can create a public pool by verifying themselves. They can collect capital from a bunch of different lenders, and now they can use this itself to delegate a credit line to this borrower A. And if the terms of the entire process, if the terms of the pool and the credit line are entirely the same, then the borrower B in this case, the proxy, he might not have to put in any extra capital from his own end. It's just entirely happening from whatever collateral that the borrower A is putting in. That's getting used to collateralize the pool that borrower B is creating. So these are some of the important steps that are taking place in this. So there's a borrower request, the lender accepts the request, and then the borrower can start drawing capital from the lender. Note that the capital that is drawn is from the lender's savings account. So what we do is that the lender's capital is essentially in the savings account, right? So it can be deployed over compound, Aave, Payun, for example. Whenever the borrower comes in and requests to draw from this credit line, we pull the lender's capital from all of these different protocols and have that supplied to the borrower to fulfill this borrower request. Again, here's a bunch of different actions that the credit line creator can take. But again, you don't have to use all of them. You can just focus on specific actions, all of which have functions associated with them in our smart contracts, and build products using that. So to make it easier for all of you to start building with Sublime, we've actually created an SDK, which you can just install using npm-is Sublime SDK. And yeah, so you can just start importing Sublime SDK from us. So this is how you could sort of potentially get started. So you need to start creating a new instance using Sublime SDK. So these are a bunch of different contract addresses that we're actually using. There's two mains objects that you could potentially use. So the connector actually allows you to call all of these smart contract functions that we made up. And we've also deployed a subgraph, which indexes all of the different events that get called during any transactions you make with our smart contracts. So those can be accessed by using the subgraph object. So for example, creating a pool in reality will require a couple of different steps. So we use this particular heuristic called create2, which uses a couple of different function calls. But by using our SDK, you can just do it using a single create pool function call. Similarly for requesting a credit line. So instead of going through the entire process of making a Web3 call, we've made it such that you can just use a single request credit line to lender function to batch all of those different function calls together. What we've also gone ahead and done is made it easier to handle any kinds of units. So typically when you're actually interacting with smart contracts, you'll have to do a couple of different base changes. So some different assets, for example, work in the basis of 10⁶, some work in the basis of 10�18. So we've handled all of that on our backend, and you just need to put in numbers as you would normally would. So 13.23, for example, you just need to put in 13.23. If the collateral ratio is 450%, you just need to put in 450. So here's all of our resources, and I'm sure these slides will be shared with you guys. So the contracts that we've used in this particular for this particular SDK are actually deployed on the Coven testnet. So you can also go through our docs, which is docs.sublime.finance. And yeah, so as I mentioned, we are actually about to launch our private alpha over the coming week. So do feel free to drop by our Discord channel as well. And our entire team is over there to help you out with anything you need.
Thank you. That was an incredible presentation. Really excited to see what people do with the Sublime tech when it comes down to building their projects throughout the event. If anyone has any questions, now would be the time to ask. As Ritik is right here, let's do it right now. This is as good a time as any. Feel free to pop them in the chat or come off of mute, turn on your camera and ask away. One of the users in the chat says, all the best with the launch. I'm really excited for you as well. Definitely going to be amplifying that from our end when I give you guys the boost we can. Sure, it feels good to actually get to launch date. I know that it's extremely stressful, but I'm sure the whole team has worked really, really hard to make that happen. So
yeah, we're super excited as well.
Yeah. I think if no one has any questions, we can wrap up early. Or if there's any last things that you'd like to go over, if you have like a minute or two, more than welcome to use that to your advantage. But any plans for B2B? I think I saw one question there.
So it's actually possible for you to set up credit lines between, so B2B in our case, and for DeFi in particular, I'm just assuming it to be DAOs because it could either be DAOs between DAOs, or it could actually be from DAOs to institutions or institutions to institutions, I guess. And that's actually one of the use cases that is possible using Sublime. So there's a couple of institutions that we've spoken to. By institutions, I mean market making firms, trading firms, who usually do end up sort of engaging in sort of borrowing and lending amongst each other. And it's entirely possible for them to now do all of that using our smart contracts directly on chain. So credit lines, for example, are anonymous, right? So a lot of the trading firms, for example, like to keep their capital movements anonymous. And with the credit lines, it's possible for them to do so.
It's a really cool use case. Yeah, I know. As anonymous as possible is incredibly important at that scale. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, or I think we can end our stream a little bit early here. Actually, no, right on time. What am I saying?
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for joining us, everybody. And thank you for the excellent presentation. Really excited to have Sublime joining us here, and really proud of your launch tomorrow.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited as well, and looking forward to interacting with all of these participants over the next month. So I took part in the ETHOnline hackathon myself last year, so it's super exciting to see that we are now one of these sponsors.
That's why we do it. It's really incredible to watch teams even form out of these hackathons and come back and be part of them. So it's great to be part of the ecosystem in that way.
For sure.
Thank you again. All right, we're going to be ending the stream here. Feel free to pop any more questions you have in Discord and the Sublime channel, and follow up throughout the event with the rest of the